Foundation of the British Empire. The English East India Company was founded by a royal charter on 31st December 1600, as a joint stock company of London merchants uniting to combat Dutch competition in eastern trade. It was given monopoly of all trade from England to the east and was permitted, even in an age dominated by mercantilist ideas, to carry bullion out of the country to finance its trade. It was not, however, given any overt mandate at that time to carry on conquest or colonization. The company formally started trading in India from 1613 after settling scores with the Portuguese, who had arrived at the scene earlier. A command from Mughal Emperor Jahangir gave them permission to establish their factories or warehouse in India, the first factory being set up in Surat in the western coast. In 1617 Jahangir received Sir Thomas Roe as a resident English envoy in his court. This was the modest beginning from where the company gradually extended its trading activities to other parts of India, with Bombay, Calcutta and Madras emerging by the end of the 17th century as three major centers of its activities. Political expansion started from the middle of the 18th century, and within 100 years almost the whole of India was under its control. P.J. Marshall, 1968, has argued that until 1784, i.e., the passage of Pitt's India Act, there was no conscious or consistent British policy for political conquest in India. Authority at home remained divided between the Court of Directors of the East India Company and the tenuous regulatory power of the government, with no one seemingly interested in acquiring territories in India until 1784. Although by then a large empire had already been acquired. Thus the growth of territorial empire in India, argues Marshall, was neither planned nor directed from Britain. It was the initiative of the company officials operating in India which decided the course of action, despite the absence of any policy directives from London in favor of conquest and colonization. Marshall acknowledged in an earlier essay that there was considerable commercial expansion during the early 18th century and the obvious connection between trade and empire was also hard to ignore. 14 But then, it was the political fragmentation and instability following the decline of developments in the periphery, rather than impetus from the metropole, which thrust upon the company a career of territorial expansion in India. And even after the 1780s, argues C. A. Bailey, the imperial expansion was primarily the Mughal power that actually facilitated the territorial expansion of the company. Its history, therefore, needs to be traced in the developments of 18th century Indian politics, where the English were only responding to these developments and exploiting the opportunities that came their way. 1s In other words, it was developments in the periphery, rather than impetus from the metropole, which thrust upon the company a career of territorial expansion in India. And even after the 1780s, argues C. A. Bailey, the imperial expansion was primarily motivated by the fiscal and military needs of the company, rather than interests of trade, the free traders being nothing more than the fly on the wheel. 86 While it is difficult to deny the importance of sub-imperialism, 87 of the men on the spot or pressures generated at the periphery as driving forces behind territorial conquests, we may also posit here some telling evidence of engagement of the metropole in the project of empire building in India. There is, first of all, considerable evidence to suggest that from the very beginning use of force to promote trade was an axiom in the practices of the East India Company. Its trade was always armed trade. And despite the apparent separation between the company and the state, the two were intimately interlinked in promoting England's diplomatic goals, as the company itself owed its privileges, and indeed very existence, to royal prerogative. 89 In English politics, the company's fortunes suffered reverses during the time of the Stuart monarchs James I and Charles I, and also during the Civil War, when its privileges came under severe attack. But the situation began to improve with the restoration of Charles II to the throne of England. To secure wealth and independence for the crown, both he and his brother James II followed an aggressive commercial policy abroad. In real terms, this involved the use of naval power in the Indian Ocean and in the Indian coastal areas, where fortified bases and enclaves in the factory ports were constructed as a part of regular policy, which, in Philip Lawson's words, may be described as the moral economy of English gunnery in these local markets. 90 The English naval guns during this period could not alter the entire trading pattern of the East, but they prevented the Indian rulers from obstructing or undermining English trade in the local markets. The relationship between the Crown and the Company was mutually beneficial. In 1660 the Company celebrated the restoration of the Stuart monarchy by offering £3,000 worth of silver plates to His Majesty. In 1661 Cromwell's charter was replaced by one signed by the King, and in gratitude the Company directors voted in 1662 https loan of £10,000 for the King. In the subsequent years more loans totaling £150,000 were offered and more charters with additional privileges followed. King and Company, as John Key writes, understood one another well. 91 The initial history of the presidency system in India is also indicative of Crown's involvement in the colonization of the country. The island Atlantant of Bombay, which Charles II received from the Portuguese crown in 1661 as dowry for his bride, was handed over to the East India Company in 1668 for a token annual rental of £10, and it was here that in 1687 the presidency headquarters of the West Coast was shifted from Surat. What is important to note here is that Bombay had been given to Charles through the Treaty of Whitehall, which included a secret provision that it would be used to protect the Portuguese settlements in India. It involved a mutual defense pact against the aggressive and expanding Dutch East India Company, and now even after the handover, that obligation to defend Portuguese positions was happily owned up by the King, and that made the English Company directors immensely grateful, offering a further loan. And the growth of the Madras Presidency was also to a large extent because of Cromwell's charter, which provided encouragement for the development of this area. The Calcutta Presidency developed later in the 18th century, and the London authorities were involved in a major way in its development and defense. But even prior to that, in the 1680s, when Aurangzeb became busy in imperial wars, seriously threatening the stability and security of English trade, the East India Company under the leadership of Sir Josiah Child decided to take an aggressive stance in defense of Company's trading interests. Its military weakness at this stage proved disastrous, although, fortunately for the Company, Aurangzeb did not take any retributive action and restored its privileges in return for an apology and a payment of compensation. But defeat does not hide the aggressive intent of the Company, which became identified with the Stuart monarchy pursuing an equally bold and authoritarian imperial policy around the globe. In the middle of the 18th century, the Europeans gained a decided technological edge over the Indians, and this paved the way for victory of what has been described by Philip Lawson as a policy of aggression and state imperialism by IPR Oxy. After James II was replaced by William and Mary in 1689, the Company once again came under increasing attack in England. The political ascendancy of the Whigs brought the Company's monopoly rights and corrupt practices into question, and a rival company was set up. However, the bill authorizing the foundation of the new company was passed by the House of Commons in 1698 only when the promoters of the new company offered a £2 million loan to the state, as against the offer of £700,000 by the old company wanting a renewal of its exclusive charter. It became clear by this time that the right to trade in the East was a marketable commodity, and if Parliament granted that right, it was the state which would benefit, instead of king and the court. 95 by 1709 the anomalies were sorted out, as the two companies merged again, and it was widely accepted in London how crucial the financial role of the company was in strengthening the state and in improving its diplomatic profile in European politics. The 18th century thus marked the beginning of self-confident territorial expansion in India, as imperial expansion and the financial strength of the company came to be integrally connected. It was discussed in the early 18th century not only among the company officials, but also widely among the London public and in the political circles. The foundation of the company's empire in India was therefore not entirely without direction from London. The relationship between the state and the company was further streamlined in the 1770s when the latter agreed to pay £400,000 annually to the state exchequer for its Indian territorial possessions and revenues earned since 1765, and thus gained an official endorsement of its position in India. By this time the company was being looked at as a powerful engine in the hands of the government for the purposes of drawing from a distant country the largest revenue it is capable of yielding. The charters of the company were seen to be providing for delegated sovereignty, while the monopoly of trade and territorial possessions were considered to be returns for the public funds and trust invested in the joint stock company, for the benefit of the British nation. The Regulating Act of 1773 resolved the ambiguities involved in the sovereignty issue, by establishing the rights of the state on all territorial acquisitions overseas. 97 If later the London authorities became at all averse to territorial expansion, it was only because of the expenses of wars. They wanted very much to share the resources of an Indian empire, but not the cost of acquiring it or the burden of administering it. 91 The expansion of the empire in India in the second half of the 18th century marked, according to P.J. Kane and A.G. Hawkins, an extension of the gentlemanly capitalism, upheld by an alliance between landed interests and financial power that was in ascendancy in London after 1688, and that was the reason why revenue and remained the central preoccupation of imperial policy. Kane and Hawkins brought the Meropole back into the discussion of imperialism, and it is difficult to deny the importance of Indian revenue resources for financing England's growing internal and overseas trade, and this undoubtedly created the impulse for conquest. But in 18th century India there were a few other significant interests is equal to other than revenue and the company's trade which were also involved in determining the specific course of territorial expansion. From the very beginning, the company's monopoly rights were breached in various ways, and in the 18th century it rose to crisis proportions. The interlopers, in the 17th century directly defeated the company's monopoly rights by conducting and financing illegal trade between England and the Indian Ocean countries. Efforts to curb their power often led to constitutional crises as in the Skinner v. The East India Company in 1668-69, when the House of Lords actually upheld the rights of an interloper. Oh, but the problem of illegal trade was actually compounded by the company's own organization. Its employees began to involve themselves in the country trade in India in order to supplement their meager salaries. There were also free merchants, who were not in the employment of the company, but were allowed to settle in its establishments. The company used to ignore this trade and even encouraged such private traders, operating in conjunction with the Indian merchants, as long as they did not directly participate in the oceanic trade to and from Europe. These two types of parallel trading activities, however, soon came into conflict in the second half of the 18th century. Whenever the interests of the private merchants clashed with those of the company, there was cheating, deceit and a whole circle of illicit credit and trading networks, eroding the profits of the company. Often there was collusion between the private traders and the interlopers, and the profit earned through this illicit trade was remitted through bills of exchange drawn on the London office of the company or the Amsterdam office of the Dutch company. In the 1750s, such remittances through only the English company amounted to an average of £100,000 annually, which was more than 60 times of the annual salary which these officials earned in company's service. More critical, however, was the misuse by these private traders of the trading privileges granted by the Mughal authorities to the East India Company. The dastak or the permits issued by the local councils of the company certifying their goods, which were to be charged no duty by the Mughal authorities, were frequently issued by the company officials to their own Indian agents, thus defrauding the Mughal treasury of enormous amounts of revenue. The Court of Directors tried to stop this malpractice, but with no effect, and soon in the 1750s this became a major cause of friction between the company and the local Mughal ruler in Bengal, creating the context for the emergence of the company as the imperial power in India. 102 However, as its empire in India was acquired over a long period of time, nearly 100 years, a myriad of factors motivated this territorial expansion. As we examine this protracted process in detail, it becomes clear that both pressures from the periphery and impetus from the metropole constantly interacted with each other, and search for revenue, quest for trading privileges and the imperatives of military exigencies all took the driving seat in Thum to accelerate the process of territorial conquest and erect in India the most magnificent empire that Britain ever had. It all started in Bengal, which in the early 18th century had become very important in the structure of the company's trade at the expense of the west coast, particularly Bombay, Surat and Malabar, as Bengal goods came to comprise nearly 60% of English imports from Asia. The company was moving towards this position gradually. In 1690 Aurangzeb's firman had granted them right to duty-free trade in Bengal in return for an annual payment of 3,000 rupees. The foundation of Calcutta in 1690 and its fortification in 1696 were followed by the grant of zamindari rights in 3 villages of Kolkata, Sonuri and Gobindapur 2 years later. The situation became unstable again at the death of Aurangzeb, but was formalized again by a firman from Emperor Farrukhsiyar in 1717, which granted the company the right to carry on duty-free trade, to rent 38 villages around Calcutta and to use the royal mint. But this firman also became a new source of conflict between the company and Murshid Quli Khan, the new autonomous ruler of Bengal, who refused to extend its duty-free provision to cover also the private trade of the company officials. The latter took to rampant misuse of dastaks, and the Nawab resented the loss of revenue. Apart from this, Murshid Quli also denied permission to the company to buy the 38 villages and refused to offer the minting privileges. The conflict between the Bengal Nawab and the English company had thus started developing right from 1717. The outbreak of the Austrian succession war in Europe in 1740 brought in hostilities between the English and the French companies to India. In Bengal, the new Nawab Alivadi Khan kept both of them under control and forbade them from getting involved in any transition of the EIGHT in the century 43 open hostilities. But French victories in South India made the English apprehensive in Bengal, as they had very little trust in the power of the Nawab to protect them against any French onslaught. Moreover, as it has been shown recently, the English private trade suffered heavily in the 1750s as a result of French competition in collusion with Asian merchants. In 1755, therefore, The English began renovating the fortifications in Calcutta without the Nawab's permission, and in utter defiance of his authority began to offer protection to fugitives from his court. The conflict assumed critical dimensions when Sirajuddaula became Nawab in 1756 and threatened the lucrative English private trade by stopping all misuse of dastuks. The more immediate issues of discord were the grant of asylum to Krishna Ballabh, who was charged with fraud by the Nawab, and the new fortifications at Calcutta, both of which posed a challenge to the authority of the Nawab and were critical to the issue of sovereignty. When the company failed to listen to warnings, Siraj showed his strength by taking over the factory at Qasim Bajar. Governor Drake believed that he could avenge this defeat by force and ignored the Nawab's overtures for a diplomatic reconciliation. This was followed by Siraj's attack on Calcutta and its capture on 20th June. This precipitated a crisis, as Robert Clive now arrived with a strong force from Madras. The English fear about Siraj's friendship with the French and apprehension that their trading privileges would be cut down led to the destruction of Hooghly and a French defeat at Chandarnagore. Apprehensive of an Afghan attack under Abdali, Siraj now preferred a negotiated settlement, but a confident Clive decided on a coup d'état. The confident servants of the company in Calcutta were not prepared to tolerate a young tyrannical Nawab threatening to destroy their trading privileges and trying to squeeze out a source of fabulous fortunes. There was already a disaffected faction at the Nawab's court, consisting of merchants, bankers, financiers and powerful zamindars, like the J. Agat Seth brothers, Mahtab Rai and Swamp Chand, Raja Janki Ram, Rai Dolab, Raja Ramnaran and Raja Manik Chand, who felt threatened by the assertion of independence by a young Nawab enthusiastically trying to reorder the balance of power in his court. There was also a natural communion of interests between the Indian mercantile community and the European traders, as many of the Indian merchants were operating in collaboration with the English company and private traders, acting as their Dadani merchants, supplying them textiles from the interior in exchange for advances or dadan. Many of the Indian merchant princes had been preferring English ships for carrying their cargo, and this in fact resulted in the gradual decline of the port of Hooghly, giving its place of pride to Calcutta.P. So a collusion of the two groups was not unlikely, and what followed as a result was a conspiracy to replace Siraj with Mir Jafar, his commander-in-chief, who was the choice of the J. Agat Seths, without whose support any coup d'état was virtually impossible. The question whether there was already a conspiracy in existence at the Murshidabad court and the English took advantage of that, or it was the English who hushed up the conspiracy, a question over which historians have fought their futile polemical battles, is less important. What is important is the fact that there was a collusion, which resulted in the Battle of Pai, Lune 1757, in which Siraj was finally defeated by Clive. It was hardly more than a skirmish, as the largest contingent of the Nawabi army remained inactive under Mir Jafar's command. But it had profound political impact, as fugitive Siraj was soon captured and put to death, and the new Nawab Mir Jafar became a puppet in the hands of the English. The Battle of Plassey, 1757, thus marked the beginning of political supremacy of the English East India Company in India. What followed hereafter is often referred to as the Plassey plunder. Immediately after the war, the English army and navy each received the hefty sums of £275,000 for distribution among their members. Apart from that, between 1757 and 1760, the company received rupees 22.5 million from Mir Jafar. Clive himself got in 1759 a personal jagir worth £34,567. So far as the company was concerned, it brought in a major change in the structure of its trade. Prior to 1757, the English trade in Bengal was largely financed through import of bullion from England, but after that year not only bullion import stopped, but bullion was exported from Bengal to China and other parts of India, which gave a competitive advantage to the English company over its European rivals. 10s On the other hand, For the company officials Plassey opened the gates to make personal fortunes, not only through direct extortion, but also through rampant abuse of dustux for their private trade. So after some time Mir Jafar found it difficult to meet the financial demands of the company and was removed from the throne to be replaced by his son-in-law Mir Qasim in October 1760. But conflict arose again over the misuse of trade privileges by the company's servants. Unable to stop the misuse of dusraks, the new Nawab abolished internal duties altogether, so that the Indian merchants could also enjoy the same privilege. The English, however, did not like this display of independence and as a retaliatory measure, again replaced him with Mir Jafar. In December 1763 Mir Qasim fled from Bengal and tried to form a grand alliance with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II and Shuja'ud-Dawla of Awadh. The emperor was in the region since 1758, when, as a crown prince, he had fled from the nasty politics of the Delhi court and tried to carve out for himself an independent kingdom in the eastern provinces. In December 1759, hearing about his father's assassination, he proclaimed himself the emperor and appointed Shuja his wazir. When Mir Qasim fled to him for refuge, it was only after long and tortuous negotiations that the two agreed to proceed against the English. Shuja's support was secured after he was promised Bihar and its treasury, along with the payment of 30 rupees million at the successful completion of the mission. But their combined army was routed at the Battle of Buxar, 1764, as an 18th-century Indian army with its segmentary social organization was in serious disadvantage against a technically efficient English army with a unitary command. What followed the English victory at Buxar is however more important. The company treated the defeated Mughal emperor with respect, because of his continuing symbolic significance in 18th-century Indian politics. Indeed, not before 1857 the British ever formally repudiated the sovereignty of the Mughal emperor. In return, by the Treaty of Allahabad of 1765, Shah Alam granted the company the Diwane, revenue collecting rights, of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, in other words, absolute control over the lucrative resources of the prosperous Bengal Subah. The British resident posted at the court of Murshidabad hereafter gradually by 1772 became the locus of real administrative power in the province, and thus it was in Bengal that the system of indirect rule as a policy of the company's imperial governance was first enacted. 109 Awadh had to stand the pressure of the Calcutta Council's lack of resources. According to the treaty, Shuja'ud-Dawla had to pay 5 rupees million. The Nawab and the company would henceforth defend each other's territories. A British resident would be posted in his court and the company would enjoy duty-free trading rights in Awadh, a clause which in later years created fresh tensions and prepared the grounds for the annexation of Awadh itself to as Eastern India thus came under control of the company by 1765. The context for expansion in the south was provided by the Anglo-French rivalry. The French were the last among the European powers to arrive in India, but they were the first to conceive the ambitious project of building a territorial empire in this subcontinent. Their main center at Pondicherry was founded in 1674 and was raised to great political prominence by Dupleix, the most illustrious French governor-general in India. He first became the governor of the French settlement of Chandanagore in Bengal in 1731, and within 10 years French trade from this center increased appreciably. Dupleix was a workaholic, who detested India, but made a personal fortune through involvement in a profitable private trade. In 1742 he got charge of Pondicherry and started working immediately to improve its trade and, more significantly, to embark on a political career. It was he who had first showed the way of intervening in disputes of the Indian rulers and thereby acquiring political control over vast territories, a technique which was later perfected by the English Company, their main European trading rival in the Indian scene. The outbreak of the Austrian Succession War in Europe in 1740 provided the immediate context for the political conflict between the two European rivals in India. Their hostility in Bengal had been contained by the effective intervention of Pahlavi Khan. But in the south, the French position was strengthened by the arrival of a fleet from Mauritius, and this resulted in an attack on the English position in Madras. With the surrender of Madras, the First Carnatic War began, as the English appealed to the Nawab of Carnatic for protection. The Nawab sent a force against the French, but it suffered an ignominious defeat. At this stage the French position was also weakened by the differences between Dupleix and Admiral La Bourdonnais, who returned to Mauritius after surrendering Madras. In 17 September 1946 Dupleix led a second attack on Madras, which capitulated, and this was followed by a siege of Fort Street David, a minor English possession to the south of Pondicherry. But before this could drag on any further, the end of hostilities in Europe by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle brought an end to the first round of Anglo-French conflicts in India as well. The English possessions in India were returned, while the French got back their North American possessions NS. Political complexities arising from dynastic feuds in India provided the context for the second round of Anglo-French conflict in the south. The succession disputes at both Carnatic and Hyderabad provided the French Governor-General Dupleix an opportunity to intervene in Indian politics and secure thereby important territorial and financial concessions. The French supported Chunda Sahib for the throne of Carnatic and Muzaffar Jung for that of Hyderabad, while the English supported their rival candidates. Both the French candidates emerged victorious, and Muzaffar Jung, the new Nizam, of Hyderabad, granted substantial territorial concessions to the French in the form of a Jagir in the northern Sarkars, Masulipatham and some villages around Pondicherry, and significant control in his court through the appointment of a French agent. This alarmed the English. A strong force arrived from Calcutta under Robert Clive, and the Second Carnatic War began in 1752. The English this time emerged victorious. Clive's occupation of Arcot was followed by the release of Muhammad Ali, who was now placed on the throne of Carnatic. Dupleix tried to retrieve French position, but the French government became displeased with him, particularly because of the financial losses, and he was recalled in 1754. His failure against the English can be explained in terms of various factors, such as his own drawing moves and miscalculations, the lack of support from the French government and the company, the French anxiety to retain their possessions in North America, and also the fundamental weakness of France in colonial struggles, as demonstrated also in later warfare. But the policies of Dupleix and the advantages he had gained in India were not jettisoned immediately. He was replaced by Godehou, who signed a treaty with the English in 1754. The treaty left the French in possession of territories around Pondicherry and Karaikal, important posts in Carnatic, the four northern Sarkars, and controlling influence at the Hyderabad court. The French power in the south was thus far from over yet. The outbreak of the 7 Years' War in Europe between England and France in 175-6 provided the context for the third and decisive round of Anglo-French conflict in South India. The French position by now had been significantly weakened by financial difficulties, as even the soldiers remained unpaid for months. The apathy of the French government was shaken at the outbreak of European hostilities, and a strong force was dispatched under Count de Lally. Yet the French lost their positions in India one after another. First fell Chandernagore in Bengal, then when Plassey was recalled to help Lally in the Carnatic, the northern Sarkars were exposed to an attack from Bengal. The fall of the Circars together with that of two other old settlements of Masulipatam and Yanam ended French influence in the Deccan. The English fleets returned from Bengal and inflicted heavy losses on the French in August 1758, and all the French strongholds in the Carnatic were lost. La Deelva's siege of Madras had to be withdrawn and the Nawab of Carnatic paid for the Cavendish coin. The most decisive battle of the Third Carnatic War was the Battle of Wandiwash in January 1760. In May, Pondicherry was https://telegram.me/upst materials https://telegram.me/freeops material. Seized and it capitulated in January 1761, once again the Carnatic Nawab paying for the campaign. Mahe in Malabar coast and the last two forts in Carnatic Jinji and Tiagar fell in the same year. The French were now without a toehold in India. A number of factors can be cited to explain this ultimate and decisive French defeat, e.g., the rashness and arrogance of Lally, who had managed to alienate nearly all the French officers at Pondicherry, the acute shortage of money which hindered military operations, the recall of Plassey from the Deccan and above all, the superiority of the English navy, their ready supply of money and their new self-confidence. By the Peace of Paris in 1763, France got back all the factories and settlements that it possessed in India prior to 1749, with the only proviso that it could not. But the balance of power in India had by now decisively changed with the steady expansion of power of the English company. The French East India Company was finally wound up in 1769 and thus was eliminated its main European rival in India. It was now also the de facto master of Carnatic, although the Treaty of Paris had assured the Nawab his entire possessions. His nominal sovereignty was respected till 1801, then, after the death of the incumbent Nawab, his territories were annexed and his heir was pensioned off Hyderabad too virtually became dependent on the English, and the Nizam in 1766 gave them the northern Circars in return for military support against his overmighty neighbours. The Anglo-French rivalry by bringing in crown troops to India in significant numbers considerably enhanced the military power of the English East India Company vis-à-vis the other Indian states. The balance of power in India had now begun to tilt decisively in its favour. This brings us to the question of the company's relationship with the other Indian rulers. The Indian states in the 18th century were perpetually involved in mutual conflicts. Their urge for territorial expansion was for gaining control over new resources, because internally in many areas a limit had been reached for extraction of fresh revenue. Politically each one was trying to establish supremacy over others, and the English were looked upon as a new force in this power game. Combining as a nation against an alien power was beyond the imagination of the Indian princes in the 18th century political context. It was no wonder, therefore, that often they entered into diplomatic alliances with the company in order to turn the balance of power in their favor in their contests against neighbors. This rivalry between the Indian states offered an opportunity, while commercial interests provided a sufficient motivation for http. English intervention in local politics. However, as the following story would suggest, the company was not just responding to opportunities, as suggested by some historians, it was also showing great deal of initiative in creating those opportunities to intervene and conquer, as insecure frontiers or unstable states were often construed as threats to free flow of trade. It is true that for a short period after the passage of the Pitt's India Act in 1784 there was parliamentary prohibition on imperial expansion, and the major thrust of the policy of the Board of Control and the East India Company during this time was to protect British possessions and promote trading interests through a careful balance of power between the Indian states, thus reducing imperial military liabilities. But that cautious policy was jettisoned when Lord Wellesley arrived as Governor-General in 1798, with a dream of conquest and a lust for personal glory. The policy of balance of power no longer worked in India, he decided even before arriving in the country, and so what was needed was empire. Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in the summer of 1798 offered him a useful tool to soften London's resistance to expansion, although he never believed for a moment that there was any danger of a French invasion of British India either overland from Egypt or a naval attack round the Cape of Good Hope. However, to assuage London's concerns, he evolved the policy of subsidiary alliance, which would only establish control over the internal affairs of an Indian state, without incurring any direct imperial liability. Wellesley's personal agenda for expansion was also buttressed by a change of personnel in the Anglo-Indian diplomatic service favouring such a forward policy. As Edward Ingram has argued, Wellesley was not formulating a policy in response to local conditions but trying to create the conditions necessary for the attainment of his objectives. If Indian politics were turbulent, he described them as threatening; if they were tranquil, he ruffled them. However, authorities in London were not gullible or innocent observers in this imperial drama either. They sanctioned all the aggressive moves in pursuance of the most important objective of British foreign policy since 1784, i.e. protecting British India against all threats from its European rivals. Wellesley was recalled in 1805 only when his wars of conquest landed the company's administration in India in a serious financial crisis. 11s Within this context, it does not become difficult to understand why the political power of Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan appeared to be a security threat to the English position in Madras and in the Carnatic. In course of a few years, Mysore's bound had stretched from the Krishna in the north to the Malabar coast in the west, which inevitably brought it into conflict with its Indian neighbours, notably Hyderabad and the Marathas. And the two were often in collusion with the English, who suspected Mysore's friendship with the French. But this threat perception was more an illusion than real, as there was now very little chance of a possible French revival in India or a French attack from outside. 16 Mysore's control over the rich trade of the Malabar coast was also seen as a threat to English trade in pepper and cardamom. In 1785 Tipu declared an embargo on export of pepper, sandalwood and cardamom through the ports within his kingdom. In 178 he explicitly forbade dealings with English traders. The interests of the private company merchants now inevitably dictated a policy of direct political intervention to protect their commercial interests. 11 But most significantly, Tipu Sultan was trying to build in Mysore a strong centralized and militarized state, with ambitious territorial designs and a political aspiration to control South Indian politics. This made him the most potent danger to the as yet vulnerable company state in the south. Young army officers like Thomas Munro and Alexander Reed could see that the mercantilist state of Mysore represented the same kind of hegemonic ambition as those of the company state in the south, and therefore could never be relied upon in any arrangement of indirect rule based on the principle of balance of power among the Indian states. Hence, although the civilian administration in Madras vacillated, they concurred with Governor-Generals Lord Cornwallis and later Lord Wellesley that Mysore needed to be eliminated. 118 There were 4 rounds of battle, 1767 to 69, 1780 to 84, 1790 to 92, and 1799, between the company and Mysore, before the latter could be finally taken over in 1799. In the First Anglo-Mysore War, the Marathas and the Nizam were with the British against Hyder Ali. In the second, they joined hands with Hyder against the British. But again the two powers sided with the British in 1790 when the latter under Lord Cornwallis declared war on Tipu Sultan, who had lately attacked their ally, the Raja of Travancore. At the end of this war the company annexed Dindigul, Baramahal and Malabar. A few years later, the spectre of a French resurgence and Tipu's secret negotiations with them gave a pretext to Lord Wellesley to move decisively for the final round of colonial aggression. In 1799 Srirangapatnam, the capital of Mysore, fell to the company, while Tipu died defending it. Mysore, then once again placed under the former Vodaya dynasty, was brought under the subsidiary alliance system of Lord Wellesley. This meant an end to the independent state. Mysore. Under this system, it would not henceforth enter into any relationship with other European powers. A contingent of company army would be stationed in Mysore and the provision for its maintenance would come from its treasury. Part of Mysore territory was given to the Nizam, who had already accepted a subsidiary alliance, and parts of it, such as Winad, Coimbatore, Kanra and Sunda, were directly annexed by the company. Meanwhile, the sudden growth of the company's cotton trade with China through Bombay from Gujarat made them concerned about the security of Deccan, then under the control of the Maratha Confederacy. A succession dispute provided the first opportunity for intervention, as Raghunath Rao, who had his nephew Peshwa Narayan Rao killed in a conspiracy, now faced combined opposition of the Maratha Sardars and began to look at the British in Bombay as a possible new ally. In March 1775 Raghunath Rai's forces were defeated in Gujarat, and a combined British army from Madras and Bombay arrived in his rescue. An inconclusive treaty of Purandar in 1776 offered a number of concessions to the company in return for its withdrawal of support for Raghunath Rao. But the treaty was not ratified by the authorities at Bengal and war was resumed again in 1777. By now the Maratha forces had regrouped under Nana Fadnis, Sindhia and Holkar and inflicted a crushing defeat on the British at Wadgav, 1779. The latter however got the revenue of southern Gujarat, as a strong contingent arriving from Bengal forced the Gaekwad to surrender it. This was the period that witnessed the rise of Nana Fadnis to the political centrage of the Maratha polity. By 1781 he and the Bhonsle family had formed a grand alliance with the Nizam and Hyder Ali against the British. But the inconclusive First Anglo-Maratha War came to an end in 1782 through the Treaty of Salbai, which committed the Marathas once again to friendship with the company and also to a confrontation with Mysore. The Maratha state was, however, in a deplorable condition by now, due to the bitter internal rivalry between the Ardars. Nana Fadnis had made the Peshwa virtually powerless. In 1795 the frustrated Peshwa committed suicide and the succession dispute that followed put the entire Maratha polity into utter confusion. The new Peshwa Baji Rao too wanted to get rid of Fadnis and sought allies in different quarters. With the latter's death in 1800 the confusion deepened even further. While Daulat Rao Sindhia supported the Peshwa, the Holkar's army started plundering his territories in Malwa. A desperate Peshwa once again looked at the company for help. In the meanwhile, with the arrival of W.L. Jesle, there had also https:// been a remarkable change in British attitudes towards the Indian states. Hyderabad, as we have already seen, had accepted a subsidiary alliance, and Mysore was crushed in 1799. So, this brought the company face to face with the Marathas, the only remaining significant indigenous power in the subcontinent. After Holkar's army defeated the Peshwa's forces and plundered Pune in October 1802, the Peshwa fled to the British in Bassein and in 1803 was obliged to sign a subsidiary alliance. Surat was handed over to the company, while the Peshwa agreed to pay for a British army and consult a British resident stationed in his court. Hereafter, Baji Rao was escorted to Pune and installed in office, but this did not mean an immediate end to independent Maratha power. This in fact marked the beginning of the Second Anglo-Maratha War, 1803-5, as Holkar soon put up a rival candidate for Peshwaship and looked for allies. Lord Wellesley and Lord Lake on the other hand fielded a large army, and for the next 2 years battle continued at different fronts across the Maratha territories. In the end, treaties of subordination were imposed on a number of tributaries of the Marathas, like the Rajput states, the Jars, the Rohillas and the Bundalas in northern Malwa. Orissa was taken control of, while the treaty with the Sindhia secured the British all his territories north of Jamuna including Delhi and Agra, all his possessions in Gujarat and claims over the other Maratha houses. The treaty also forbade other Europeans from accepting service in any Maratha army and made the British arbiters in any dispute between the Maratha houses. But even this did not mean the final demise of the Maratha power. The wars, on the other hand, meant huge expenses for the company, and the Court of Directors, already dissatisfied with the forward policy of Lord Wellesley, recalled him in 1805. Lord Cornwallis was reappointed as the Governor-General in India with specific instructions to follow a policy of non-intervention. This allowed the Maratha Sardars, like Holkar and Sindhia, to regain some of their power, while their irregular soldiers, known as the Pindaris, plundered the countryside in Malwa and Rajasthan. The situation continued for some time till the arrival of Lord Hastings as the Governor-General in 1813. He initiated the new policy of paramountcy, which privileged the interests of the company as a paramount power over those of other powers in India, and to protect such interests the company could legitimately annex or threaten to annex the territories of any Indian state. 119 Peshwa Baji Rao too around this time made a desperate last attempt to regain his independence from English by rallying the Maratha chiefs. This led to the Third Anglo-Maratha War, 1817-19, in which Holkar's army and the Pindaris were thoroughly crushed. The British took complete control over the Peshwa's dominions and Peshwaship itself was abolished. Significant parts of the territories of Bhonsle and Holkar were also ceded to the company, while they entered into alliance of subordination. P. The English East India Company had now complete mastery over all the territories south of the Vindhyas. In North India too there had been by now significant acquisition of territories. Ever since the victory at Buxar and the Treaty of Allahabad, Awadh was serving as a buffer state between the company's position in Bengal and the turbulent politics in North India, particularly imperiled by Maratha depredations. British strategic interests in Awadh were secured by the stationing of a resident at the court of Lucknow in 1773 and the positioning of a permanent British garrison in Awadh, to be paid for by Nawab Shujaudullah through the payment of a subsidy. Soon, however, this became a contentious issue, as the amount of subsidy demanded by the company increased gradually. To meet this increasing demand, the Nawab had to impose more taxes, which soured his relationship with the Tluktars. This was the prime reason for more political instability in the state, which eventually became a pretext for direct annexation. Warren Hastings, who became the Governor-General in 1774, had first argued that the best way to ensure regular payment of the subsidy was to annex those territories of Awadh whose revenues were equal to the amount of subsidy. Distraught by the French and Mysore wars, the company's desperate need for money at this stage was amply revealed in the demands imposed on Chet Singh of Banaras, his inability to pay and his subsequent deposition in August 1781. The crisis was also manifested in the bizarre saga of extortion, under direct instruction from Warren Hastings, from the Begums of Awadh, who still controlled the treasures of Shuja, ostensibly to pay the mounting debt of the Nawab to the company. So annexation of Awadh was clearly on the cards for quite some time, and Wellesley gave it a concrete shape in 1801, when the Nawab expressed his apprehension that he might not be able to pay the subsidy. There were other reasons too. Ever since the Treaty of Allahabad, Nawab Shujaudullah had been complaining about the rampant abuse of the company's duty-free trading rights by the European private traders and their Indian gomostas. The company's authorities only half-heartedly tried to control it, as it was beyond their power to retrain these merchants. Had become crucially important for expanding British seaborne trade from Bengal. In the last decade of the 18th century, there was an expanding demand for indigo in London, and about 3/5 of its total export from India came from Awadh. By the beginning of the 19th century, Awadh raw cotton became another chief item of supply to China market to keep the imperial balance of trade in favor of Britain. 121 In this context, the high rate of taxes imposed by the Nawab on exports from Awadh even after the Treaty of 1788, signed during the time of Lord Cornwallis to ensure free trade, was certainly an irritant. 122 Annexation seemed imminent when, with the arrival of Lord Wellesley, there was a clear tilt in company's policies in favor of vigorous expansion.